Everyone warned us about the single father raising 7 kids next door. I was about to call CPS until I looked through the fence. They tell you in nursing school that the hardest compressions you'll ever do are on somebody you know. 12 years in an emergency department, and I never had to test that. My CPR happened under fluorescent lights, on strangers, with a code team around me and a crash cart at my elbow. Then, one Saturday morning in June, I found myself kneeling on my neighbor's patio with my hands stacked over his sternum, counting out loud to a rhythm I've known longer than I've known my husband, while his 5-year-old daughter stood 4 feet away reciting her address to a 911 dispatcher in a voice so calm it scared me more than the man under my hands did. My name is Lily Harmon. My father isn't breathing. There are 7 children in this house. Our address is 612 Sycamore Lane. Flat. Smooth. Like a grocery list. I knew that voice. I'd heard it through my kitchen window 2 days earlier, rehearsed over and over until every word lost its edges, and it had frightened me so badly that I'd typed a phone number into my phone and carried it around like a loaded thing. The number for Child Protective Services. 40 minutes before I went over that fence, I had been standing at my kitchen window with my thumb hovering over the call button, ready to report David Harmon for whatever it was he was doing to those 7 kids. I need to tell you what I saw first, in the order I saw it, because I have replayed that first month 100 times looking for the exact moment I should have understood, and I still can't find it. Maybe you will. Everyone in the comments always believes they would have. I didn't. We moved on to Sycamore Lane the first week of May. My name is Claire. I'm 41. My husband Mark builds risk models for an insurance company, which means he spends 9 hours a day calculating how likely people are to die, and then comes home and tells me to relax. I've spent 12 years as an ER nurse at Mercy General, mostly nights, which means I've spent 12 years watching what actually happens when the numbers come true. The rental was a small miracle. 3 bedrooms, a fenced yard, $400 under market, and zoned for the best elementary school in the county. Mark kept waiting for the catch. The floors were level, the water heater was new, the landlord answered emails in under an hour. The catch apparently lived next door. Cheryl Dunmore came across the street with a foil-covered casserole before we'd finished unloading the truck. 60-something, robe over leggings at 2 in the afternoon, the kind of woman who hands you a dish with one hand and a dossier with the other. You'll hear the whistle, she told me, nodding at the gray 2-story on the other side of our fence. Then you'll understand. That was our welcome to the neighborhood. Whistle? I asked. 5 a.m. every morning, rain, shine, Christmas. She lowered her voice like the house could hear her. Single father, 7 kids, no wife anyone has ever seen. Boot camp, I call it. That man runs a boot camp over there. I laughed because I thought she was exaggerating, and because I was holding a casserole and it seemed rude not to. At 5 the next morning, I found out she wasn't. The whistle cut through the dark like something surgical. One short blast. I was already awake. 12 years of night shifts will ruin your circadian rhythm forever, and I stepped out onto our back porch with my coffee and froze. 7 children stood in a straight line on the wet grass next door. The oldest was a girl, maybe 16, at the head of the line. The youngest, at the far end, looked about 5, her hair in 2 neat braids that no 5-year-old ties herself. Between them, 5 more kids, stair-stepped by height, all dressed, all still, all silent. The sky wasn't even gray yet. The porch light threw their shadows long across the lawn. Their father walked the line with a clipboard. He was tall, mid-40s, the kind of build that suggests he'd carried heavy things for a living at some point. He checked shoes, fingernails, collars. He lifted the smallest girl's chin with one finger and looked at something on her face. I couldn't tell what. Then made a note. He never raised his voice. I want to be clear about that because of everything Cheryl would say later and everything I would think later. In all the weeks I watched that yard, I never once heard that man raise his voice. He never smiled either. When the inspection ended, he stepped onto the porch and spun a wooden wheel nailed to the rail. A homemade thing, like a game show prop built by someone with no interest in games. It clicked around and stopped. He read from it. Each kid got a word. Laundry, trash, coop, bathrooms, kitchen. I'd learn all the stations eventually. They scattered without a sound. No whining, no giggling, no shoving, which if you've ever seen 7 siblings in one yard is the strangest part. Children bounce off each other. It's practically physics. These kids moved like water finding its channels. I stood on my porch with my coffee going cold and watched a 7-year-old boy rake out a chicken coop in the dark, and I felt something in my chest I didn't have a word for yet. Mark came out in his robe around 6, when the older kids were hanging laundry in assembly line formation. Huh, he said. They're incredibly organized. They're terrified, I said. He looked at me sideways. You got all that from laundry? I didn't answer, but I want to be honest about what I was thinking, because this story doesn't work if I lie to make myself look better. I was thinking about a Tuesday night 3 years ago, a 9-year-old brought into my ER with a spiral fracture and a story that didn't match the x-ray, and how the thing I remembered most wasn't the injury. It was how polite he was, how still. Kids who feel safe are loud. Stillness is a skill, and it gets taught, and in my experience, nobody teaches it for free. That's what I knew. 12 years of pattern recognition, boiled down to one sentence. Quiet children have usually paid for the quiet. I just didn't know yet that there was more than one currency. The routine never broke. That was the first thing I cataloged, because cataloging is what I do when something bothers me. Whistle at 5i, line at 5:02, inspection, wheel, chores until 6:40, breakfast. I could see the kitchen window from our yard. 7 heads heads around a table, the oldest girl plating food at the stove while their father sat at the head with what looked like paperwork. School bus at 7:25 for the middle ones. The oldest girl drove a gray minivan with the two littlest ones buckled in back. 16 years old, driving a 5-year-old to kindergarten every morning like a suburban chauffeur. I told myself plenty of teenagers drive their siblings to school. I told myself structure isn't a crime, that half the parenting books at any airport bookstore would call that man a genius. I told myself that the flinch I felt every morning at 5 a.m. was my own baggage, imported from 100 bad nights at work, and that it wasn't fair to unpack it in a stranger's yard. The rationalizations held for about a week. Then I started noticing the afternoons. Every day around 4, the backyard next door turned into a classroom. Not a playground, a classroom. The oldest girl, Emma, sat the little ones at a picnic table and taught them things. Real things. I watched her teach a 7-year-old to sew a button with his tongue between his teeth. I watched a 12-year-old walk 2 smaller kids through sorting a stack of papers into piles. And when the wind carried a few sheets into my yard and I handed them back over the fence, I saw what they were. Utility bills, bank statements, a cell phone bill with the account numbers blacked out with marker. They were teaching children to sort household bills by due date. It's for math, the 12-year-old said, seeing my face. Sophie, I'd learn, polite as a bank teller. Dad says real numbers are better than worksheets. Sure, I said, and handed the papers back, and stood at that fence for a while after they'd returned to the table. Because here's the thing, it was a good math lesson. It was also the kind of thing you teach someone when you expect them to need it. Cheryl materialized at my fence line that evening like she'd been summoned by my doubt. She had a wine glass in one hand and her phone in the other, and she leaned in with the delight of a woman who has been waiting years for a fresh audience. You've seen the afternoon school by now, she said. 16 years old, and that girl Emma runs the house like a second mother. Cooks, drives, signs permission slips. My granddaughter's in Ben's class, the teacher told me. Tell me that's normal. You ever seen him hug one of them? Even once? I hadn't. I'd been watching for 2 weeks, closer than I wanted to admit, and I had never seen David Harmon touch any of his children except to straighten a collar or check a scraped knee like a mechanic checks a tire. Somebody should call somebody, Cheryl said, and took a sip of her wine. That's all I'm saying. People exaggerate, I said. Structure isn't abuse. Said Cheryl, in the tone of a woman filing my answer away for future use. I want to pause here and tell you about the notebook, because it matters later. Around that time, I started writing things down. Dates, times, what I saw. It's an occupational reflex. In my job, if you didn't chart it, it didn't happen. And I told myself I was doing it to be fair. If I ever did call someone, I wasn't going to be a woman with a feeling. I was going to be a witness with documentation. So I documented. And the act of documenting did something I didn't expect. It forced me to write down the other column too. May 19th. Ben, 7, fell off bike in driveway. David outside within seconds. Knelt. Checked collarbone, wrist, pupils. Checked pupils. Correctly. No yelling. Kid didn't cry until dad got there. Note, kids who are scared of a parent don't save their crying for the parent. That last line sat there on the page looking back at me. I didn't know what to do with it, so I did what any reasonable professional does with contradictory data. I ignored it. Then I met Ben properly. He was the 7-year-old, all elbows and cowlicks. And one Saturday in late May, he appeared at my fence while I was tying up tomato vines, staring at the plants like they were performing magic. Those are early girls, he said. My sister Emma taught me about tomatoes. You have blossom end rot on that one. It's not a disease, it's calcium. Everybody thinks it's a disease. Is that so? I said. You can fix it with crushed eggshells. We compost ours. He pointed at a yellowing leaf. That one's just old. Don't worry about that one. And then he smiled at me, this sudden, gap-toothed, completely ordinary little boy smile, and I realized it was the first smile I had seen from any of the 7 children next door in almost a month. I was still deciding what to say to him when the whistle blew. One short blast. Ben ran, mid-sentence. Not gotta go, not a wave. His body simply obeyed before the rest of him got a vote, and he was across the yard and through the gate in 5 seconds flat, and I stood there holding a tomato vine and my own heartbeat. David was on his porch. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't done anything but blow that whistle and wait, and his kids had responded like a hand closing. He looked at me across the 2 yards. Not angry, not embarrassed. He looked at me the way TSA looks at your bag on the belt. A long, neutral, assessing look, like I was the variable in the yard that needed evaluating. Then he nodded once, politely, and went inside. My hands were unsteady when I went back to the tomatoes. I noted the time. 9:47 a.m. That night I called Rosa. Rosa Delgado has been a school counselor for 19 years, the last 11 at Jefferson Elementary, and she has sat across from more frightened children than anyone else I know. We worked a case together years ago, an ER admission that turned into a custody intervention, and she is the least hysterical human being on the planet. If Rosa says a house is on fire, you don't smell for smoke. You just leave. I laid it all out. The whistle, the line, the inspections, the bills, the way a 7-year-old ran from a smile like it had a curfew. Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me the question that I'd been avoiding asking myself. What are the kids like when he's not watching? I thought about Ben at my fence, chattering about calcium. Emma at the stove, flicking a dish towel at one of her brothers. I'd seen that once, and the brother had ducked, grinning. Lily, the little one, walking the fence rail of the garden bed with her arms out like a gymnast while Sophie spotted her, both of them laughing low, like the laughing itself wasn't forbidden, just rationed. frowned. Normal, I admitted. They're normal when he's not watching. Rosa said. That's the part I'd sit with. Kids who are being hurt at home are usually one kid at school and another kid at home, but it's the home self that's rehearsed, if that makes sense. What you're describing is backwards. She paused. That doesn't mean nothing's wrong, Claire. Something in that house is not standard, but there's a difference between a child who's afraid of their parent and a child who's afraid of a situation. The behaviors rhyme. They're not the same animal. Before anybody makes a call that puts 7 kids into the system on a Friday afternoon, somebody should figure out which one it is. How do I do that? You're a nurse, not a detective, Rosa said. You watch. You write it down. And if a kid ever tells you something, or you see an injury, or you see him frighten them on purpose, you stop watching and you call that minute and you let the professionals sort it out. That's the whole job of a mandated reporter. We're smoke detectors, Claire. We're not supposed to decide whether the fire is worth putting out. I wrote that in the notebook too. Smoke detector, not the fire department. I'd like to tell you I felt better. Mostly I felt like a woman standing in a hallway between 2 doors, listening at both. 2 weeks later, the ambulance came. It was a Thursday, 4:15 in the afternoon. No sirens. It rolled up the street quiet as a delivery truck and turned into the Harmon driveway, and I was at my kitchen window with a dish towel in my hands before I'd made any decision to move. Here is what did not happen next. Nobody screamed. Nobody cried in the yard. No neighbor drama. No kids scattering in panic. Instead, the front door opened and the children filed out onto the lawn and arranged themselves along the walkway like it was a fire drill. Littles in front, Sophie holding Lily's hand. Emma came out last, and she came out walking fast but not running, which is a distinction they teach you in nursing school, because running people drop things. And she met the paramedics halfway across the grass holding a red plastic folder. She handed it over. The lead paramedic opened it, read for maybe 15 seconds, and I watched his entire posture change. He stopped asking her questions. He nodded at something she said, and the two of them went inside together like colleagues, 16 years old, and a paramedic had just stopped asking her questions. They were in there for 40 minutes. When they came out, David walked between them under his own power, shaking his head at the gurney like it had insulted him. There was a conversation at the back of the rig, the paramedic holding out a clipboard, David signing it, the universal body language of a man refusing transport against advice. The ambulance left empty. Nobody explained anything to anyone. Cheryl stood on her porch filming the whole thing on her phone, robe flapping, and got footage of precisely nothing. The next morning, the whistle blew at 5 a.m. Same as always. Line, inspection, wheel. But after that Thursday, the house next door changed in ways I couldn't stop cataloging. Emma carried the red folder everywhere now, to the mailbox, to the minivan. I watched her transfer it from her school bag to the kitchen counter to a hook by the back door. A specific hook, always the same hook, the way you'd handle something with a chain of custody. The older kids started carrying little spiral notebooks and checking things off in them, and the drills got worse. I need to be precise about this part, because this is the part that almost made me a different person in this story. It was a Thursday evening, 8 days after the ambulance, and I was doing dishes with the window open. The Harmon's kitchen window faces ours across the fence, maybe 40 feet, and sound carries in the quiet part of the evening. I heard David's voice, level as a bubble in a spirit level, again, and then a small voice. Lily, 5 years old. My name is Lily Harmon. My father isn't breathing. There are 7 children in this house. Our address is 612 Sycamore Lane. The door is unlocked. My sister is doing compressions. Again, she said it again. Again, 10 times, 15. I stood there with my hands in the dishwater going cold, listening to a 5-year-old sand the fear out of a sentence about her father's death until it came out flat and smooth, like a grocery list, until it was a skill. My father isn't breathing. What kind of man makes a baby rehearse that? I know the answer now. I didn't then. Then, I only had 12 years of worst-case pattern matching and a heart rate I could feel in my ears, and every dark scenario my job has ever taught me arrived at once. Men who script their children, men who rehearse their households for the day someone official shows up. I'd met those men. I'd charted their handiwork at 3 in the morning. I dried my hands and they weren't steady, and that night I couldn't sleep. He's making babies memorize scripts, I told Mark, in the dark, around midnight. Something is wrong in that house. I've been making excuses for a month and something is wrong. Mark was quiet for a while. My husband thinks in actuarial tables, which makes him infuriating in an argument and occasionally horribly correct. You're seeing 5 minutes of their lives a day, he said, and assuming you understand the other 23 hours and 55. Rosa said, watch and document. You've documented a man who checks his kids' fingernails and a bunch of children who know how to do laundry. I documented a 5-year-old rehearsing her father's death, Mark. That stopped him. It stops everyone. It should. Okay, he said, finally. That's strange. I'll give you. That's strange. But Claire, Cheryl thinks he's running a cult because he doesn't wave at her. Cheryl films their yard in her bathrobe. You are a medical professional. You get to be better than a feeling. A feeling is how half my saves start, I said, and rolled over, and we both lay there, not sleeping in our separate certainties. At 6:51 the next morning, Friday, my phone buzzed. Cheryl. She typed the number for Child Protective Services into the message itself, bold, like a ransom note. Cheryl, County CPS intake line, 24 hours. I've been keeping video. Cheryl, if you don't call by Monday, I will, and I'll tell them the nurse next door watched for 6 weeks and did nothing. I read that last line about 40 times, because here's what Cheryl understood, in her nosy, wine-soaked, weaponized way. I'm a mandated reporter. Not legally, maybe, not off the clock, not for things I see over a fence, but that's a lawyer's answer, and lawyers don't work in my chest. If that house was what I feared it was, then every day I spent being fair was a day billed to 7 kids, and if I called and I was wrong, I knew exactly what I'd be setting in motion, because I've stood in the ER while it happened to other families. The caseworkers, the interviews, the separations that take one afternoon to start and years to undo. 7 children, a single father, 1 phone call. Smoke detector, Rosa said. It's not your job to decide if the fire is worth it. Saturday morning, I stood at my kitchen window with my phone in my hand. The number was typed in. The whistle had blown an hour earlier, right on schedule. And the yard next door was quiet, chores done, the ordinary machine of that house humming along. My thumb hovered over the call button. I remember the light. That's the ER nurse in me. When everything goes wrong, some part of my brain starts timestamping. 6:42 a.m. Gold light, dew still on the fence line, my coffee going cold on the counter, my thumb over a green circle that said call, and I genuinely do not know to this day whether I was going to press it. Then I heard the crash. Heavy, wrong, the specific sound of weight hitting ground that shouldn't. Not a dropped box, not a slammed door. Mass, from behind David's fence. And then a child's voice, loud and clear as a fire drill. Plan red! 2 words, and the entire house next door detonated into silence with moving parts. And I was across my yard before I knew I was moving, phone still in my hand, bathrobe catching on the rose bush. And I hit the fence and found the gap where 2 boards had warped apart and pressed my eye to it. I will see what was on the other side of that fence for the rest of my life. 7 children were flowing through that yard in dead silence. Flowing, that's the only word. Caleb, the 14-year-old, sprinted past the gap with something boxy and yellow in both hands. Sophie was at the side gate throwing the bolt, swinging it wide, then kneeling to drag a garden hose out of the path, clearing the route, my brain translated, before I'd consciously understood any of it. Jonah had the 2 littlest ones by the shoulders, planting them on the porch steps like statues. Stay. Ben stood at the corner of the house where the driveway meets the yard, both arms up, ready to flag something down. Lily, 5 years old, hair in braids, stood in the middle of the patio with a cordless phone pressed to her ear with both hands. My name is Lily Harmon. My father isn't breathing. There are 7 children in this house. Our address is 612 Sycamore Lane. The door is unlocked. My sister is doing compressions. Flat, smooth, like a grocery list. And Emma was on her knees on the patio, arms locked, shoulders driving down in a rhythm I have taught to interns, counting under her breath. And their father was on the ground beside her, flat on his back on the concrete, gray, still, not moving at all. I stopped being a neighbor. Every version of me from the last 6 weeks, the watcher, the documenter, the woman with a number in her phone, all of it burned off in about half a second, and what was left went over that fence in a bathrobe. I'm a nurse, I heard myself shouting. ER nurse, Emma, I'm coming to you. She didn't stop compressions. She looked up at me for 1 second, and I will tell you what was in that 16-year-old's face, because everyone always asks. It wasn't panic, it was triage. She assessed me, exactly the way her father had assessed me over the fence weeks ago, decided I was useful, and made a call. 2 minutes since he went down, she said in rhythm, like a report. No breathing, no response. Caleb has the AED. Dad's cardiologist packet is in the red folder on the gate hook. Sophie folder. Caleb slid in on his knees across from her and cracked open the yellow box. A Phillips heart start, the real thing, the kind that costs more than a mortgage payment. And the machine started talking in its calm robot voice. And this 14-year-old peeled the backing off the pads and placed them correctly. Upper right chest, lower left side. His hands were shaking so hard the second pad went on crooked and he fixed it without being told. I'll take compressions, I said, dropping beside Emma. You bag breaths? You know breaths? 30 and 2, she said. He trained us. He trained us. The AED told us to stand clear. Emma grabbed Lily's ankle gently. The little one had drifted a step closer, still narrating to the dispatcher, and pulled her back. The machine analyzed. I knelt there in the longest 4 seconds that exist in this universe, in a stranger's backyard, in my bathrobe, next to a 16-year-old with her father's life in her hands, and the robot voice said the 2 best words in the English language. Shock advised. The jolt lifted him the way it always does, that awful marionette arch, and Lily's voice wavered for the first and only time, a single crack on the word breathing, and then she finished the sentence anyway. 5 years old. She finished the sentence. I was back on his chest before the machine finished telling me to be. 1 round, 2. My shoulders screaming, gold morning light, a rooster losing its mind in that immaculate coop, and somewhere under my hands, on compression number, I don't know. David Harmon coughed, moved, breathed, ragged, horrible, gorgeous breathing. Recovery position, Emma said, already rolling him with the exact hand placement from a first aid manual, and that is when the sirens finally reached our street, and Ben, 7 years old, at his corner post, raised both arms and flagged the ambulance into the driveway like ground crew bringing in a plane. Total time from crash to paramedics, per the dispatch log I'd see later, 6 minutes, 40 seconds. Total time the children needed instructions from any adult, 0. The lead paramedic was a broad, unhurried man named Tom Villarreal, 14 years with the county fire department, and I watched him do the same thing his colleague had done 2 weeks earlier. Open the red folder, read for 15 seconds, and change. Dilated cardiomyopathy. cardiomyopathy, he said to his partner in the shorthand voice. Ejection fractions 19. He's on the list at St. Luke's. Dr. Rao's her name. It's all here. Known VTAC history. He looked at the AED, at the pads, at Emma, at me, and did the math out loud. Witnessed arrest, immediate bystander CPR, defibrillation inside 4 minutes. He shook his head slowly. Ma'am, I want you to hear this because people never believe it. Out of the hospital, that man's odds were about 1 in 10. Whoever set this scene up before we got here bought him the other 9. Whoever trained this family gave him his only chance. He did, I said. My voice came out strange. He trained them himself. Villarreal looked at the 7 kids, still at their stations, still silent. Jonah's arms around the littles on the steps, and something moved across his face that I recognized because it was moving across mine. Then he's the best prepper I've ever cleaned up after, he said. And I've been doing this 14 years. They let Emma ride in the rig because she was the one holding the folder, and the folder held the notarized medical authorization with her name on it. Of course it did. Of course he'd thought of that. I stayed with the other 6. What else was there to do? Mark came over the fence about 4 minutes behind me. My husband, the risk analyst, who took one look at the yard and started making pancakes for 6 silent children in a stranger's kitchen, because that was the variable he could control. A sheriff's deputy did a welfare check within the hour. 7 minors, single parent transported. It's automatic. And this is the part I keep coming back to. Sophie, 12 years old, met him at the door with the second folder. There was a second folder. Blue. Inside, a notarized temporary guardianship designation naming David's sister, Ruth Harmon, a hospice nurse living 400 miles away. Her phone numbers. A signed letter authorizing any cooperating adult neighbor to supervise until her arrival. The children's insurance cards, allergy lists, the pediatrician's after-hours line. The deputy read it twice and said quietly, I've seen estates settled with less paperwork. Ruth was in her car within 20 minutes of Sophie's call. She arrived at 4:05 that afternoon, hugged each child in birth order like it was a protocol of her own, then found me in the kitchen, took both my hands, and said, You're the nurse from the fence. He told me about you. He said, if it ever happens in the yard, I think the nurse next door will come over the fence. I had to sit down. He watched me watching them. I said, I was standing at my window this morning I know exactly what you were about to do, Ruth said, not unkindly. You were about the 5th. Sit down. I'll make tea and I'll tell you about my brother. Here is the truth about the house next door. Assembled from Ruth at the kitchen table, from Emma in a hospital corridor, and eventually from David himself. 3 years ago, David Harmon's wife Anna sat down at Sunday breakfast with a headache, said the light seemed too bright, and was gone before the ambulance reached the hospital. Ruptured aneurysm, 39 years old. No warning, no plan, no list of passwords, no instructions. David was a logistics manager who had spent 20 years building contingencies for warehouses, and his own wife died on a Sunday, and he didn't know which pediatrician took which kid or where the insurance cards were kept. The older children watched their father, this competent, organized man, get put on hold by the utility company while their mother's funeral was still being planned, because the account was in her name and he couldn't answer the security questions. Emma was 13. She told me, in that hospital corridor, that the scariest part of losing her mom wasn't the grief. It was watching Dad realize we weren't ready, she said, for anything. 14 months ago, David went to Dr. Anita Rao, 22 years of cardiology at St. Luke's, about what he thought was persistent bronchitis. It was his heart failing, idiopathic dilated cardiomyopathy, ejection fraction of 19%, with runs of the kind of arrhythmia that kills you standing up. Dr. Rao put him on the transplant evaluation track and scheduled him for an implantable defibrillator. His insurance flagged the ICD for prior authorization review, then flagged it again. 9 weeks of appeal letters and counting at the time he collapsed. So David Harmon did what a logistics man does when the system leaves a 9-week gap between his children and their second dead parent. He bought a refurbished AED for $1,340 out of pocket and mounted it in the kitchen. He wrote the folders. He built the wheel, and this is the detail that undid me when Emma explained it. He built the wheel specifically so that no chore would ever belong to one child, so that Emma would never become the mother. Everyone learns everything was the rule. The bills, the cooking, the buttons, the bike tires, not a boot camp, a curriculum. Every skill in that yard was a rung on a ladder he was building for 7 kids to climb down from his death. The 5 LAM inspections, Dr. Rao had told him mornings were his highest risk window. He wanted them awake, dressed, fed, and within earshot of each other before his most dangerous hour of the day. He checked their fingernails because his wife used to, and it was the only part of her routine he knew how to keep. And the drills, plan read, the flat little scripts, the thing that had my thumb over the call button, came from Dr. Rao's own nurse, who'd told him that the #1 reason children fail to save a parent isn't ignorance. It's panic. Kids freeze or they call and can't produce an address. So he sanded the panic out of the words in advance, 10 repetitions at a time, until his 5-year-old could say the worst sentence of her life like a grocery list. You heard Lily practicing, Emma said. It wasn't a question. Through the window. I told him the neighbors could hear. He said, and here she did a small, involuntary smile that took 10 years off her face. He said, good, then the neighbors will know what to do too. I stood in that corridor and cried, and Emma, 16 years old, 11 hours after doing CPR on her own father, patted my shoulder, and then said the thing I'll be carrying for the rest of my life. People keep almost calling somebody about us, she said. You're the first one one who came over the fence instead. Cheryl made her call anyway. Friday evening, it turned out. Before the collapse. Before any of it. Her report landed in the county queue and produced a visit the following Wednesday from Dana Whitfield. 9 years with Child and Family Services. A compact woman with a laptop bag. And the flat, pleasant affect of someone who has walked into every kind of house there is. David was still at St. Luke's. The arrest had, in the grim comedy of American healthcare, instantly resolved the ICD authorization, and Dr. Rao's team implanted it that Tuesday. So Dana Whitfield inspected a home run by an aunt, a 16-year-old, and a chore wheel. She stayed 3 hours. She interviewed the children separately, her protocol. She reviewed the folders, red and blue, and photographed the AED mount and the laminated plan cards taped inside the pantry door. Plan red, plan yellow, plan blue, each with its steps and pictures for the ones who couldn't read yet. I know all this because she interviewed me too, as the reporting party's named witness. Cheryl had in fact told them the nurse next door had watched and done nothing, and Dana Whitfield sat at my kitchen table, read my notebook front to back, both columns, and closed it gently. The disposition will be unfounded, she said. I can tell you that because you'll be notified anyway as a named party. She tapped the notebook. Do you know what I usually find when a report says a father is running a boot camp? Usually nothing. A strict parent and an annoyed neighbor. Sometimes something bad. Both of those take me a day to spot. She looked out my window at the gray house where Jonah was teaching Lily to ride Ben's old bike in slow, wobbling circles. It took me 3 hours to understand this one because I have been doing this 9 years and I have never once walked into a house where a dying parent was the safest thing in the neighborhood. She stood, packed her laptop, and paused at the door. For the record, she said, your notebook was good documentation. Both columns. Most people only keep the column that agrees with them. Cheryl's consequence, if you're waiting for one, was smaller than internet justice and exactly the right size. The report is confidential, but Cheryl is Cheryl. She'd spent that first week telling half the street that someone finally did something about that house. So when the disposition came back unfounded, and when the fire department gave the Harmon kids a chain of survival citation at a little ceremony that made the local news, Villarreal's doing, with footage that turned out to come from Cheryl's own porch camera, subpoenaed politely off her cloud account by the department's PR office. Everyone on Sycamore Lane could do the math. Nobody confronted her. Nobody had to. She still waves at me over her wine glass. She has not offered anyone a casserole since. Her curtains, I noticed, stay closed at 5 in the morning. I don't hate her. That's the uncomfortable part I'm supposed to leave out of a story like this. And I won't. Strip away the bathrobe and the filming and the spite. And Cheryl was a woman who saw quiet children and worried. So was I. The difference between us was 40 feet, a gap in the fence, and the dumb luck of a crash happening while my thumb was still hovering. I got to be the neighbor who went over the fence. I was one Saturday morning away from being the neighbor who made the call that put 7 kids into emergency placement while their father lay in a cardiac ICU. Both of those women were me. I try to remember that every time I feel certain about a stranger's life. 6 weeks later, the whistle still blows at 5. I'm usually up. 12 years of nights, I told you I'm ruined. And some mornings I take my coffee onto the porch and I watch. David walks the line slower now. There's a fresh scar under his collarbone where the ICD sits. A little guardian angel with a lithium battery, and he's climbed to the top tier of the transplant list, which is a sentence containing both the best and worst news a family can get. The inspection is the same. Shoes, fingernails, collars. The wheel still spins. Ben still gets the coop more than statistics should allow, and has begun filing formal complaints about it, out loud, at volume, and nobody silences him. And last Tuesday I watched Sophie laugh so hard at his closing argument that she sat down in the wet grass. The kids come over the fence now. Through the new gate David and Mark built where the warped boards used to be. Ben and I have an ongoing tomato consultancy. He charges eggshells. Emma comes over on Thursday evenings and does her homework at my kitchen table. Not because anything's wrong at home, but because Ruth and I made a rule that 16 deserves one room, once a week, where nobody needs her. First time, she slept 11 hours on my couch. Nobody woke her. The house next door survived an entire morning without her, which I think was the actual lesson, and I think David assigned it. Cheryl asked me once, over my fence, back when I still thought I understood that house, you ever seen him hug one of them, even once? Here is my answer, Cheryl, on the record. Every morning now, at the end of the line, after shoes and fingernails and collars, David Harmon goes back down the row and hugs each of his children, one at a time, oldest to youngest, like it's the last item on the checklist. It was always going to be on the checklist. He was just waiting until he was sure they could stand on their own before he let them see him lean. The whistle still cuts through the dark at 5 a.m., and I know the whole street can hear it. It used to sound like an alarm to me. Now I know it for what it is, what it always was. A man counting his children at first light, 1 breath, 7 answers, not fall in, still here.